All right, this one should also be pretty short and sweet. We want to go through and cover loops in this particular chunk. Now, we've already covered a lot of the interesting aspects in the section on blocks, where we were talking about the idea of multiple entry points, multiple exit points. What do we do in terms of initialization? What do we do in terms of syntax? So I'm just going to touch on a couple of points here. So obviously, the syntax you use for loops is going to be highly recognizable. Right? What you do in terms of while loops, do while loops, repeat loops, or repeat until, or for loops, or for each loops, all sorts of different kinds of loops that are going to be supported in different languages with, of course, different syntax. And so that is something that you'll be pretty familiar with. One of the things that you'll first recognize about languages is just how it handles loops and what kind of syntax it uses and what kind of weird quirks it has with respect to how loops work. So in terms of just the core options or considerations that I wanted you to take a look at, obviously we've got top tested loops like while loops, or bottom tested loops like repeat until or do while. Typically the big distinction between them being the top tested loops you're going to check before you ever do the loop body, so it's possible you'll never do the loop body, whereas the bottom tested ones you're typically going to make one pass through before you do your first test. A couple of the things that we should be used to thinking about now in terms of scoping rules. Does the loop have its own internal scope? If you declare variables inside the loop, for instance, can you access them outside the loop? In most cases, it's pretty intuitive in terms of how block scopes work. It's going to be pretty obvious how the scope for loop variables work, but you do hit the kind of edge cases, like the variables declared within the declaration portion of a for loop, or if you've got variables that are declared inside a do while loop, for instance, it's not always intuitive that you can't use them in the condition check at the bottom of the loop because they're already out of scope by then. So as it's going through executing the loop, you go through the body of the loop where you're in scope and you do this condition check where it's out of scope, and then you go back into the body of the loop where it's in scope again. So there are some things that aren't always entirely intuitive. If you can get at any of these things after the scope ends, after the loop ends, I guess not after the scope ends, but after the loop ends, if you can get at some of those variables, what are their values? Right? If you've got a for loop where you're iterating through the values of some variable, what's the value of that variable after you leave the for loop? Again, just stuff to consider. Do you have things like last, final, break, continue, and all the styles of things that we talked about in the block section? Which ones are supported for different kinds of loop? If you've got things where there's some kind of automation taking place, where the loop does some of the update statements for you, for loop where you're going through and you've got an x++ that happens automatically at the end of every pass through the loop, or you've got a for each loop where after every pass it steps through to the next item somehow in that. If that's actually supported, or if that's actually one of the types of loop you have available to you, then can the programmer actually manually alter that sequence within the loop? So in the case of our for loop here, inside the body of the loop, can I manually change x? And what do I have to know about what's going to happen if I do that? For things like a for each loop, is there some way for me to alter the iteration sequence as we're going through it? Or is there some way for me to control the iteration sequence, period? Right? For each loops in many languages will go through and pick their own ordering somehow for what sequence the elements will be handled in. So again, most of the ideas for loops we should be pretty familiar with. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implementation of loops in the next section that we'll get to in just a little bit here.